The evening sky was painted in shades of orange and purple as Marcus Johnson drove down the quiet suburban streets. The hum of his car was the only sound for miles, and he let out a sigh of relief after a long day at work. His mind wandered to home, to the small apartment where his mother would be waiting with her soft smile and a hot meal. He felt tired but safe, thinking the day's troubles were behind him. Without warning, flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't done anything wrong. He signaled and slowly pulled to the side of the road. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as he tried to calm the rising panic in his chest. The police cruiser stopped behind him, engine idling, and 2 officers stepped out. "Evening, sir. Do you know why we pulled you over?" one of the officers asked, his voice firm but polite. Marcus shook his head, trying to keep his voice steady. "No, officer. I'm not sure. I was just heading home from work." The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked Marcus over. Something about the situation felt off, though Marcus couldn't explain it. "We received a report of a vehicle matching this description. Just need to ask you a few questions." Marcus nodded, hoping it would be quick. He had nothing to hide. But as the officer walked back to his car, his partner approached Marcus's window, shining a flashlight into his face. The sudden brightness made Marcus blink, and a shiver ran down his spine. "License and registration, please," the officer said. Marcus handed over his documents, trying to speak calmly. "Here you go, officer. I hope everything is okay." The officer examined the papers, muttering something under his breath. Marcus felt a pit growing in his stomach. Something about the way the officers were acting didn't feel normal. They exchanged glances, whispers, and nods. The calm, polite stop he had expected was slipping away. After a few tense minutes, the officer returned to Marcus's window. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle," he said, his tone now cold and commanding. Marcus froze. "Step out? Why?" His heart pounded in his chest. I didn't do anything wrong," he stammered, voice shaking. "You need to come with us," the officer replied, ignoring his protest. The sense of fear that had been simmering inside Marcus now boiled over. He felt trapped, confused, and angry all at once. How could this be happening? He had a clean record, a job, responsibilities. He wasn't a criminal. Marcus stepped out slowly, hands raised slightly. The officers moved with precision, and he suddenly felt their eyes on him like a predator sizing up prey. One of them cuffed his wrists behind his back with cold, metallic certainty. The sound of the handcuffs clicked in the silent street, echoing like a final verdict. As Marcus was led to the cruiser, neighbors peeked from behind curtains, and the faint glow of porch lights cast long shadows on the pavement. He wanted to shout, to explain, to make them see the truth, but the words died in his throat. The officers didn't ask for explanations. They didn't listen. They only followed procedure, or so they claimed. Inside the cruiser, Marcus sat in stunned silence. His mind raced, searching for logic, for any reason this was happening. It must be a mistake, he thought, though the knot in his stomach told him it wasn't going to be simple. Every passing second added to the dread that something far bigger than him was at play. Back at the station, Marcus was led into a small, sterile room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making the air feel heavy and oppressive. He was asked to sit, but the officers didn't sit themselves. They circled him like sharks, their presence suffocating. One of them began asking questions, accusatory in tone, as if Marcus's denial was meaningless. "I've never seen you before. Do you know why you're here?" the officer asked, leaning in. Marcus shook his head. "No, I swear. I don't understand this. I've done nothing wrong." The officers exchanged glances again, whispering to each other. The tension in the room was unbearable. Marcus's chest tightened, and he fought to keep his panic in check. He knew fear could make people act in ways they wouldn't normally, but he had to stay calm, had to find a way out of this nightmare. Hours passed, or it felt like hours. Marcus lost track of time, the monotony broken only by the occasional question or the shuffle of papers. He watched the clock tick, each second mocking him. He was tired, confused, and angry. And yet, a tiny ember of hope remained in his chest. There had to be someone who could help him, someone who would see the truth. Finally, Marcus remembered his brother. David Johnson, the U.S. Attorney General, a man who commanded respect and power. Marcus hesitated only a moment before picking up his phone. Every ring of the line seemed like an eternity. Finally, the call connected. Marcus? David's voice was calm but filled with concern. Marcus could feel the weight of his brother's presence even through the phone. He explained everything as quickly and clearly as he could, his voice tight with emotion. David listened carefully, the silence on the other end heavy and deliberate. "This is going to be okay," David said finally. "I'm going to handle this. Just stay calm. Don't say anything else." Marcus nodded, even though David couldn't see him. The hope that had been dwindling flickered back to life. Perhaps there was a way out, after all. Perhaps justice could be found, even in a system that seemed deaf to the truth. As he waited, Marcus's mind replayed the events of the evening. The fear, the confusion, the disbelief, it all felt surreal, like he was caught in someone else's story. But the reality was undeniable. He was in trouble, and only one person had the power to change it. Back at the police station, the officers noticed the phone call. There was a tension shift in the room, subtle but undeniable. They had pulled Marcus over thinking they were in control, but now something had changed. Unseen forces were at play, forces they had no way to measure. Marcus sat back, cuffed hands resting on his knees, waiting. Waiting for his brother's influence to take effect, for the truth to surface, for the nightmare to end. Every passing minute was a mix of hope and terror, a balance so fragile it could shatter at any second. Outside the station, the night pressed in, quiet except for the occasional distant sound of traffic. Marcus was trapped in a small, sterile room, yet the world outside seemed endless. He thought of his family, his life, the injustice he faced. And somewhere in the mix of fear and hope, he realized the story was far from over. The first act of this night was ending, but the tension had only begun to build. The audience, if they were watching, if they could see, would feel the suspense in every heartbeat, every glance, every silence. Marcus's fate hung by a thread, and the question remained, would justice come in time, or would the mistake spiral into something far worse? The call ended, and Marcus set the phone down. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions inside him. Somewhere, David Johnson was moving, making the calls, exerting influence, bending the impossible toward the inevitable. Marcus could only wait, hoping that the brother he trusted would not fail him. And in that small, cold room, with the fluorescent lights humming above and the world silent outside, Marcus Johnson understood the first terrifying lesson of the night. Sometimes, the people you trust most are the only ones who can save you when the world turns against you. Marcus sat in the small, sterile room of the police station, the handcuffs biting slightly at his wrists. His mind raced, replaying every moment of the evening. How could a routine drive home turn into this nightmare? The officers outside whispered constantly, their words sharp and cutting, though he couldn't make out everything. It was clear, though, that they were confident in their version of events. They didn't know him, didn't care who he was, they only knew the paperwork that seemed to paint him as guilty. The minutes stretched endlessly. Marcus's stomach tightened with every footstep, every shuffle of papers on the other side of the glass door. He thought of calling his mother, but that could only make things worse. He needed someone powerful, someone who could cut through the confusion and stop the injustice. His brother. David. The U.S. Attorney General. He picked up his phone again, hands shaking. Just the thought of talking to David calmed him slightly, though it didn't erase the fear that had lodged itself deep in his chest. One call, that was all it took. One call, and maybe this nightmare would begin to end. He dialed. Each ring felt like it stretched into hours, each second thick with anticipation. Finally, David's calm, steady voice answered, cutting through the panic. "Marcus? What's going on?" David asked, concern immediately evident. Marcus explained the situation quickly but clearly. The wrongful arrest, the fear, the cold indifference of the officers. David listened quietly, his silence both reassuring and heavy. When he finally spoke, his words were deliberate. "Stay calm. Don't argue. Don't say anything else. I'll handle it." Marcus nodded, though David couldn't see him. He set the phone down and leaned back against the hard chair, trying to breathe normally, trying to convince himself that the nightmare was only temporary. But in the officer's eyes, he saw the suspicion, the doubt, the arrogance of people convinced they were right, even when they weren't. Hours passed. Marcus had lost track of time, the room's harsh fluorescent lights leaving a constant glare in his eyes. He had been questioned repeatedly, asked the same questions over and over as if repetition could uncover the truth by magic. Each time he answered honestly, the officers scribbled notes, occasionally muttering to one another. Marcus knew they were digging for something, anything, to justify what they had done. Meanwhile, outside the room, the station had become a quiet storm. Officers whispered in hushed tones. Someone mentioned the phone call Marcus had made. The name David Johnson carried weight, though most in the station would never admit it aloud. Subtle glances, nervous coughs, tightened jaws, it was clear that power could change the game in ways Marcus hadn't imagined. Marcus's thoughts wandered to his life before tonight. The job he worked hard for, the friends he trusted, the family he loved. Everything seemed small against the weight of what was happening now. He thought about his mother, wondering if she suspected the full horror of the night, and about his sister, who would worry if she knew. But he couldn't tell anyone else now. That call to David had to be enough. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and an officer stepped in. Marcus's heart thumped against his chest. He braced himself for more questions, more accusations. But instead, the officer's voice was slightly different this time, measured, almost cautious. "Marcus, the chief would like to speak with you," he said. Marcus froze. The chief? What could possibly be happening now? He was led down the narrow, fluorescent-lit hallway, the echo of his footsteps filling the air. The officers around him seemed quieter, almost respectful, as if the name of his brother had created an invisible shield around him. In the chief's office, Marcus was seated across from a man who looked authoritative and calm. The chief's eyes held curiosity, perhaps even a hint of unease. "Marcus Johnson," he said, "we received a call from someone very high up." "Your brother, I believe?" Marcus nodded, unsure how to respond. "Yes, sir. My brother is trying to help." "I didn't do anything wrong," Marcus said, voice small but steady. The chief leaned back, fingers steepled. "We understand. But we have protocols, procedures. We need to make sure everything is in order." His tone was firm, but there was a subtle acknowledgement that Marcus was not like the others they might arrest. There was a tension in the air, a delicate balance between law and influence, between procedure and power. Marcus sat silently, letting the chief's words wash over him. In his mind, he replayed the events, the fear, the growing hope with his brother involved. There was no guarantee that the nightmare was over, but he could feel a shift. The officers had realized that this wasn't a simple stop. They were now entangled in a situation far beyond a routine mistake. As Marcus waited, he thought about what had brought him here. Driving home, following the rules, being a law-abiding citizen, these things hadn't mattered in this moment. The world seemed unfair, cruel, and unpredictable. But there was one constant he could rely on: family. His brother had the power, yes, but more importantly, he had the will to intervene. And in that knowledge, Marcus found a fragile sense of hope. Back in the interrogation room, the other officers whispered among themselves. Some were defensive, some frustrated, others cautious. It was a delicate dance, one they hadn't anticipated. Marcus could feel the subtle shift in the room, the weight of expectation pressing down. Every movement, every glance, every murmur carried tension. The officers were aware now that this situation could spiral into something far bigger than they had imagined. Time continued to pass, each minute dragging on with slow, relentless pressure. Marcus thought about his future, about the life he had worked so hard to build, and how easily it could be upended by a single mistake, a single misjudgment. He clenched his fists, feeling the cold bite of the handcuffs, a constant reminder of his current helplessness. But still, he waited. He had to. Finally, the phone rang again. This time, it was David. Marcus felt a surge of relief and tension all at once. The call was short, precise, and filled with authority. David had spoken to the higher-ups, to people with influence, and action was now in motion. Marcus listened carefully, absorbing every word, trying to stay calm even as his heart raced. The officers outside seemed different now. The shift was subtle but undeniable. The confidence they had displayed earlier had softened, replaced by caution, hesitation. Marcus could feel the balance of power changing, slowly tilting in his favor. The fear hadn't left completely, but hope now had its place. Marcus leaned back, letting himself breathe for the first time in hours. The fluorescent lights above no longer seemed as harsh, the room no longer as suffocating. Change was coming. Justice, or at least the intervention of someone powerful enough to correct the mistake, was on the horizon. But the story was far from over. Marcus knew that the officers might resist, that bureaucracy could slow the process, and that fear could make things unpredictable. The next steps would be crucial, and every second counted. He had survived the first wave of terror, but the battle was just beginning. Outside, the night remained quiet, almost serene, a stark contrast to the storm inside the station. Marcus's thoughts turned to his family, to the bond that had sustained him through every hardship. He realized, more than ever, that hope could be a powerful force, even in the darkest situations. As the officers prepared to act under David's direction, Marcus sat quietly, waiting. The tension in the room was thick, a silent testament to the drama unfolding. Every glance, every movement, every whispered word carried weight. Marcus's life hung in the balance, but this time, he was not alone. He had someone who could tip the scales, someone who would not rest until justice was served. And in that quiet, suspenseful moment, Marcus understood the fragile but undeniable truth: sometimes, hope and courage are not enough on their own. Sometimes, they need the strength of those willing to use their power to stand against injustice. The night was far from over, the story far from complete. But the first threads of change had been woven. The tension remained, but now it was joined by the promise of action. Marcus's ordeal was still unfolding, but a new chapter had begun, a chapter where the wrong could be righted, where the power of family and justice might prevail against fear and mistake. Marcus sat in the small, sterile room of the station, his hands still cuffed, though the cold bite of the metal seemed to matter less now. The tension had shifted slightly since his brother's call. There was hope, yes, but hope carried its own weight, a weight that pressed down on his chest, reminding him that the battle was far from over. He tried to focus on breathing, on keeping his heart steady, but his mind refused to cooperate. Every footstep outside, every creak of the door, made him flinch. Meanwhile, miles away in Washington, D.C., David Johnson leaned back in his chair in his spacious office, phone pressed to his ear, eyes narrowed in concentration. His world was filled with endless responsibilities, laws, and crises, yet this call from Marcus demanded his immediate attention. He listened carefully as his staff relayed the details of the wrongful arrest, the officer's refusal to release Marcus, and the layers of bureaucratic hesitation that stood in the way of justice. David's jaw tightened. He had fought battles in courtrooms and political arenas, but nothing felt quite as personal as this. His younger brother, innocent and scared, trapped in a system that refused to see the truth. He could feel Marcus's fear through the voice on the phone, each tremor and pause driving David's determination. This was no longer just a family matter, it was a test of how far influence and justice could stretch against stubborn authority. Back at the station, Marcus watched the officers outside the room carefully. Their whispers were now laced with hesitation. Something had changed, though he wasn't entirely sure what. One officer glanced at the clock, then back at him, avoiding eye contact. Another tapped a pen nervously on the counter. Marcus realized that even in their position of power, the presence of his brother's authority loomed over them, invisible but undeniable. Minutes later, the door opened, and a stern-looking officer stepped in. Marcus braced himself, expecting more accusations, more intimidation. Instead, the officer's voice was unusually careful. "Marcus, the chief has been advised to review your case personally. There may have been a mistake." Marcus's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Could it really be that simple? Could a mistake be corrected so quickly? He didn't dare hope too strongly. As the officer left, Marcus's phone buzzed again. It was a text from David. "Stay calm. I'm making calls. Don't respond to any questions without me." Simple words, but they carried power. Marcus read them over and over, letting them sink in. He realized that control over his fate had shifted slightly, though he was still very much in the middle of a storm. David, in his office, had started making calls. To the police commissioner, the mayor's office, and even a few trusted contacts in law enforcement. His voice was firm, authoritative, and unwavering. He did not threaten, he did not plead. He simply made it clear that justice had to be done, and Marcus Johnson was not to be treated as a criminal. Behind each call, the subtle power of his position created ripples of tension in offices and stations across the city. People who might have dismissed Marcus's plight suddenly paid attention. Meanwhile, Marcus sat quietly, listening to the distant echoes of footsteps in the hall. His mind wandered to his life before this chaos, his work, his friends, his quiet apartment, and he felt the contrast sharply. The world seemed cruel and unpredictable, and yet he also realized that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, help could arrive in the form of someone who would not allow injustice to stand. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower, casting a dim glow through the small windows of the station. Marcus's nerves were stretched thin, but he remained composed, focusing on the fact that he was no longer entirely alone in this fight. Each step David took behind the scenes brought him closer to freedom, closer to the truth being acknowledged. Yet, he knew that bureaucracies could be slow, stubborn, and sometimes resistant to even the highest authority. Patience, he realized, was as crucial as courage. Finally, the door opened once more, and this time, it was the police chief himself who stepped in. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The chief's presence carried weight, authority, and scrutiny. He did not sit immediately, instead pacing the room, hands clasped behind his back. His eyes studied Marcus carefully, weighing every movement, every expression, every subtle gesture. Marcus met his gaze as best he could, holding on to the fragile thread of hope that David had woven from afar. "Marcus Johnson," the chief began, his voice calm but firm, "I understand there has been a serious mistake. The reports we received were incomplete, and it seems there has been a misidentification. We are reviewing the situation, and I want to resolve it immediately." Marcus's chest rose and fell rapidly. Could it be that simple? Could the nightmare be ending? Yet, he knew better than to believe that power alone could erase hours of fear and humiliation. The chief continued, outlining the next steps. Marcus would be released from the station, but there would be forms to fill, statements to make, and explanations to provide. It was procedural, he explained, yet it was also a recognition that Marcus had been wronged. Every word was carefully chosen, signaling the delicate balance between correcting an error and maintaining authority. As Marcus followed the officer to the release desk, he felt a surge of relief mixed with lingering anger. His hands, finally free from the handcuffs, shook slightly as he rubbed them. Freedom, however small, was sweet. Yet he knew that this was not just about him. The event had layers of injustice, systemic errors, and subtle biases that could not be erased with a simple release. The story was bigger than one night, one arrest, one man. Outside the station, Marcus took a deep breath of the cool evening air. The world seemed brighter now, more real. He thought about his brother, about the invisible network of influence and care that had ensured his release. Gratitude washed over him, mixed with a simmering sense of responsibility. He had survived the night, but the lessons would stay with him forever. David, still in his office, monitored the situation from afar. He knew the release was only one step in a larger battle. There would be reports, investigations, and questions about why a man could be arrested so easily, so wrongly. Yet, in this moment, he allowed himself a brief sense of satisfaction. His brother was safe, and the system, however flawed, had been reminded of its limitations. Marcus returned home that night to the warm embrace of his mother. Her worry had been immense, her relief palpable. He recounted little of the ordeal, sparing her the details of fear and humiliation. Instead, he focused on the relief, the family bond that had carried him through. Yet in his mind, the images of the sterile room, the flashing lights, the uncertainty, lingered. They were reminders that justice could be fragile, and vigilance was always necessary. As he lay in bed, trying to sleep after hours of tension, Marcus reflected on the night's events. The fear had been real, the danger immediate. But the intervention of someone he trusted, someone with power and compassion, had turned the tide. The world, he realized, was complex, sometimes cruel, but also capable of redemption when the right forces moved at the right time. And while the night had ended in temporary relief, Marcus knew that the story was far from over. There were lessons to be learned, mistakes to be addressed, and a city that had witnessed the thin line between fear and justice. The suspense of the night would linger, not just in his memory, but in the echoes of a system forced to acknowledge its errors. Outside, the city lights twinkled like distant stars. Marcus's story had captured a small moment of human vulnerability, a night that could have been tragic, and yet, through courage, persistence, and the invisible power of family, had found a temporary balance. The next chapter awaited, filled with tension, revelation, and the undeniable pull of justice yet to be fully realized. The small room at the station felt even smaller now that Marcus had been released from his cuffs but not yet fully freed from the tension that clung to him like a shadow. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. Marcus tried to steady his breathing, but every shuffle of papers, every faint creak of a door made him flinch. Even though he was technically free, the night's terror lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over. Back in Washington, David Johnson paced his office, his mind sharp and deliberate. Marcus's phone call had set events in motion, but David knew this was only the beginning. A wrongful arrest, no matter how quickly corrected, left consequences. Mistakes like these could ruin reputations, careers, and trust. David picked up the phone repeatedly, calling aides, legal advisors, and trusted contacts within the police department. Every conversation was precise, intentional. There was no room for error. Marcus had already suffered enough, now it was time to ensure the system acknowledged it. Meanwhile, the officers at the station were unsettled. What had started as a routine arrest had turned into a situation none of them had anticipated. The whispers between desks were nervous, careful, and slightly panicked. Marcus's name had been mentioned repeatedly, not just in conversation but in quiet speculation. The brother, the attorney general, what does this mean for us? They realized quickly that their authority, previously unchallenged, now had limits. Influence existed outside their walls, in ways they could not control. Marcus tried to focus on his own thoughts, grounding himself in reality, but the memory of handcuffs biting his wrists, the cold metallic weight pressing into his skin, was fresh and raw. He thought about his mother, the relief she would feel knowing he was okay. He thought about the small apartment waiting for him, the life he had fought so hard to maintain. Yet he also knew that this night had changed something fundamental. Nothing would ever feel quite the same. David, relentless in his approach, had already begun digging deeper. He reviewed the police reports, cross-referencing witness statements and traffic cameras. The evidence was messy, inconsistent, and in some places outright incorrect. It wasn't just a human error, it was a failure of the system. Each discrepancy he uncovered added fuel to his determination. He realized that correcting this mistake for Marcus meant not only releasing him but confronting the larger issues that allowed such an arrest to occur in the first place. Back at the station, Marcus's nerves were tested further. Officers kept glancing at the clock, checking in with the chief, and whispering to one another. They were aware of the phone calls, the power of influence behind them. Yet authority is a strange thing, it can be flexible when convenient and rigid when convenient. Marcus understood that he was not simply fighting for his freedom but against hesitation, pride, and human stubbornness. Every step forward required patience. Every breath was calculated. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and a new officer entered. He was younger, his face tight with worry, and he carried a stack of papers that seemed heavier than any object Marcus had ever lifted. "Marcus Johnson?" he asked carefully. Marcus nodded. "These are statements we need you to review. Please verify the details before we finalize everything." Marcus reached for the forms, hands still slightly trembling. He skimmed through the pages, noting the errors, the exaggerations, and the subtle mistakes that had led to this wrongful arrest. Each error was a small but powerful reminder of how fragile justice could be. Marcus felt a surge of both anger and clarity. He had experienced firsthand how a system designed to protect could easily harm. But he also knew that now, with David's intervention, there was a chance to correct it. He carefully marked the corrections, signing where necessary, but the process left him emotionally drained. David, monitoring from afar, was relentless. He coordinated with internal affairs and legal teams, ensuring that every step of Marcus's release was documented and every procedural misstep was acknowledged. His voice was firm, authoritative, unwavering. He did not yell. He did not plead. He simply demanded accountability. In every call, in every email, he reminded the officers, the staff, and the administration that Marcus Johnson's rights had been violated, and that recognition and correction were not optional, they were mandatory. As the night stretched on, Marcus noticed the subtle changes in the station. The officers no longer approached him with aggression. They were polite, cautious, and tense. Something had shifted in the atmosphere. He realized that the presence of authority, even from a distance, could change behavior in profound ways. Yet, he also knew that their compliance was only as good as the immediate pressure applied. Once that pressure eased, would they still acknowledge the mistake? The question lingered, sharp and uneasy. David, meanwhile, began reviewing protocols and procedures that had allowed the wrongful arrest to occur. He traced the mistakes, identified the gaps, and quietly prepared for a broader conversation with police leadership. This was no longer just about Marcus, it was about accountability, about ensuring that a mistake like this could not repeat itself. The stakes were high, and David knew the tension would only grow as more people became aware of the situation. Marcus, exhausted and emotionally raw, thought about his life outside the station. He imagined the sun rising over the city, the streets filling with cars, people starting their day unaware of the turmoil that had unfolded the night before. He imagined his apartment, his mother, and the ordinary moments that now seemed so precious. And he realized something vital: this experience, terrifying and exhausting, had taught him about resilience, about hope, and about the power of family standing behind you. Finally, the chief himself re-entered the scene, this time with a more conciliatory tone. He acknowledged the errors, apologized formally, and began the process of ensuring Marcus's full release and clearing his record. The weight of the night's events seemed to settle slightly, though the emotional impact on Marcus was still profound. Every step taken toward justice felt like climbing a steep hill, exhausting but necessary. The officers who had initially arrested Marcus were now visibly uneasy, aware of the scrutiny and the reach of authority that had been applied. Their whispers had turned into cautious discussions, and every glance they gave Marcus carried the awareness of oversight. The balance of power had shifted, though subtly, reminding Marcus that influence, patience, and persistence could bend even the most rigid systems. As the hours passed, Marcus finally stood outside, breathing deeply of the cool night air. The station behind him hummed with quiet tension, but he felt the first real sense of freedom. His hands, once shackled, now moved freely, though the emotional weight of the night remained heavy on his shoulders. He knew this was not the end. There would be discussions, investigations, and lingering questions about the mistakes that had been made. Yet, for the first time since the sirens had flashed behind his car, he felt hope, fragile but undeniable. David, still in his office, allowed himself a brief moment of relief. His brother was safe, and steps were being taken to correct the wrongdoing. But he also knew that influence alone was not enough. Change required diligence, documentation, and accountability. The night had revealed flaws in the system, and it was up to him to ensure that those flaws were addressed, not ignored. Marcus walked home slowly, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement from an earlier rain. Each step felt heavier and lighter at the same time. He carried the memory of fear but also the weight of survival. The night had tested him in ways he could not have imagined. Yet, as he approached his apartment, he realized that fear and hope could coexist, that danger could be tempered by action, and that even in the darkest moments, family could be a lifeline strong enough to pull you through. In the quiet of his apartment, Marcus finally allowed himself to sit, to breathe, to absorb the reality of the evening. The handcuffs, the flashing lights, the interrogation, and the fear, they were all behind him, but the lessons remained. Justice had come, though imperfectly, and he had witnessed the power of persistence, authority, and love in action. And while the night's suspense had begun to fade, Marcus knew that this story was far from complete. The officers would reflect, the city would talk, and the system would take note. But he had survived, and in that survival, he found strength, hope, and the undeniable truth that sometimes, the bonds of family and the courage to act could change even the most terrifying situations. The morning sun rose over the city, casting golden light across streets that were beginning to stir with life. Marcus Johnson walked slowly, still reeling from the previous night's ordeal. Though he was physically free, the emotional scars ran deep. The fear of being wrongfully arrested, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, and the uncertainty of what could have happened lingered. Each step he took toward normalcy felt heavy with the memory of flashing lights, harsh voices, and cold steel cuffs. Even though he had been released, Marcus knew that the story was far from over. David had handled the immediate danger, but the consequences of the night's events would ripple far beyond the station walls. News of the arrest had begun to leak, first quietly among colleagues and friends, then slowly into the public eye. Social media buzzed with mentions of Marcus Johnson, the man wrongfully arrested, and the influence of his powerful brother. People expressed outrage, disbelief, and support in equal measure, and the pressure on the police department began to mount. Back at the police station, the officers who had arrested Marcus were tense. Their initial confidence had evaporated, replaced with a combination of worry and defensiveness. They knew that the story was no longer just about a routine stop, it had grown into a public matter, one that could damage careers and reputations. The whispers between them were cautious, measured, and filled with unease. Every call, every message, every subtle glance reminded them of the reach of the Johnson family and the weight of authority now watching their every move. Marcus, though exhausted, could feel the shift. The world outside seemed different now. People he passed on the street no longer saw him as just another man, they saw someone who had been wronged, someone whose story was capturing attention. The mix of fear and hope that had carried him through the night now mingled with a new emotion, anticipation. What would happen next? Could justice truly prevail in a system that had almost failed him? David Johnson, meanwhile, had not rested. His office buzzed with activity as he coordinated with aides, legal teams, and media advisors. Every step was deliberate. He wanted to ensure that the public narrative supported the truth, that Marcus had been wrongfully arrested, that the police had made errors, and that accountability would follow. Yet he also had to navigate the delicate politics of power, influence, and public perception. One misstep could escalate tensions unnecessarily, but careful action could transform the story into a powerful example of justice and family loyalty. As the hours passed, Marcus began to receive messages from friends and coworkers. Support poured in, words of encouragement, disbelief at what had happened, and admiration for the way he had handled the situation. These messages were a small comfort, but they reminded him that his experience was not just personal, it had become a symbol of something larger. Every note, every message, every online comment added weight to the unfolding story. Marcus realized that his ordeal had ignited conversations about fairness, justice, and the responsibility of those in power. By midday, the situation had escalated further. Local news outlets picked up the story, reporting on the arrest, Marcus's release, and the involvement of the U.S. Attorney General. The headline stories painted a picture of a system tested, a mistake uncovered, and a family determined to ensure justice. The coverage created tension within the police department, where internal affairs and higher officials began reviewing the officers' actions in detail. Every move the department had made, or failed to make, was now under scrutiny. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, staring at the television as the story unfolded. He saw his face on the screen, heard his name mentioned, and realized that the world was watching. It was surreal and unsettling. The adrenaline from the night before had not fully worn off, and the media attention added another layer of stress. Yet, amidst the chaos, he felt a strange sense of empowerment. His story was no longer confined to a single room or a single night, it had reached the public, forcing acknowledgement and accountability. At the station, the officers involved struggled to navigate the growing pressure. Every action was scrutinized, every report double-checked, and every statement carefully crafted. They realized that their authority had limits, and that power could exist beyond the walls of the station. Marcus's story had become a catalyst, a reminder that the system, while structured, was vulnerable to mistakes and oversight. The balance of power was shifting, and the officers felt it acutely. David continued to guide the situation with precision. He ensured that Marcus had access to legal counsel, coordinated with internal affairs, and monitored media coverage. His presence, even from a distance, was felt throughout the department. The officers knew that any misstep could have consequences not just for them individually, but for the entire station. The stakes were high, and the tension was palpable. As the day progressed, Marcus began to process the emotional weight of the night. The fear, anger, and frustration were still present, but they were now tempered by a growing sense of resilience. He realized that this experience had taught him something invaluable: the importance of perseverance, the power of family, and the need to speak out against injustice. Each moment of reflection strengthened him, preparing him for the challenges that might still lie ahead. By evening, public interest had reached a peak. Social media discussions, news segments, and online articles created a wave of attention that the police department could not ignore. Marcus found himself at the center of a story that transcended his personal experience. It was no longer just about a wrongful arrest, it was about accountability, fairness, and the influence of those willing to act when the system faltered. As Marcus prepared for the night, he received a call from David. His brother's voice was calm, measured, but carried the weight of authority. "Marcus, the department is taking full notice now. Internal reviews are underway. You need to rest, but be ready to provide any statements if necessary. This is only the beginning." Marcus nodded, understanding that his journey was not over. The night had been a turning point, but the story was still unfolding. Outside, the city lights glimmered, reflecting the complexity of a world where fear, hope, and power intertwined. Marcus walked slowly, feeling the cool evening air on his face. He thought about the events of the past hours, the fear, the release, the growing public scrutiny, and realized that his life had changed forever. Yet amidst the uncertainty, he felt a sense of purpose. His ordeal was not just personal, it was a story that could inspire, provoke, and perhaps even create change. Inside the station, the officers prepared for the aftermath. Reports were filed, statements reviewed, and procedures evaluated. The tension that had dominated the night was now joined by a new emotion: awareness. They had seen firsthand the reach of influence and the consequences of mistakes. Every decision they had made, every action taken, had been observed and weighed. Marcus's story had forced the system to look at itself in a way it rarely did. As the night deepened, Marcus returned home, exhausted but not broken. He thought about the lessons learned, the challenges faced, and the family that had stood firmly by his side. The events of the night and the day that followed had tested him in ways he could never have anticipated. Yet, in surviving and witnessing the power of advocacy and influence, he found a new understanding of strength, justice, and the human spirit. Even as he drifted toward sleep, Marcus knew the journey was not complete. There were still steps to take, statements to make, and a story to see through. But for the first time since the flashing lights had appeared behind his car, he felt a balance between fear and hope. The public scrutiny, the media attention, and the rising tension had not only highlighted the error but also illuminated the path toward justice. The night was quiet, but the echoes of the day's events would linger. Marcus's experience had sparked conversations, challenged authority, and reminded everyone involved that mistakes, when confronted, could lead to accountability. And though the journey ahead remained uncertain, Marcus felt a quiet resolve. He had faced fear, endured injustice, and survived. Now, with his brother's guidance and the eyes of the public watching, he could face whatever came next with courage and determination. The city streets were quieter than usual as Marcus Johnson walked home, the evening air cool against his skin. The events of the past days still weighed heavily on him. Freedom had been restored, but the memory of the handcuffs, the harsh questions, and the officer's cold indifference lingered. Each step felt like a reminder of the fragility of justice. He knew the story wasn't over, in fact, it was only just beginning. David Johnson, sitting in his office miles away, leaned forward over his desk. The internal reviews and media coverage had forced the police department to react, but David wasn't satisfied. He knew the officers involved needed to be held accountable, and the system needed a reminder that errors like this could not go unchallenged. He made a series of calls to department officials, his voice calm but sharp, leaving no room for delay or misunderstanding. Marcus's ordeal had become a test, not just of his brother's influence, but of the very mechanisms of justice itself. Back at the station, tension simmered like a pot about to boil over. The officers who had arrested Marcus were now fully aware that their actions had consequences far beyond a routine stop. Their whispers had turned into careful, defensive conversations, eyes darting towards supervisors and each other. They were no longer in control, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Every movement, every decision, every report carried weight they had never imagined. Marcus, trying to find calm, returned to his apartment, but sleep eluded him. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events in his mind. The flashing lights, the officer's commanding tone, the cold handcuffs, they were all etched into his memory. Yet alongside the fear was a growing sense of determination. He realized that surviving the ordeal wasn't enough, he needed to see it through. He needed justice to be acknowledged, fully and publicly. The following morning, David's influence began to take a more direct form. He arranged meetings with top police officials, demanding answers and explanations. Each conversation was deliberate, precise, and unyielding. David didn't shout, and he didn't threaten. He simply presented the facts, the evidence, and the glaring errors that had led to Marcus's wrongful arrest. His calm authority filled the room, forcing those present to confront not only their mistakes but also the implications of their oversight. Inside the station, officers felt the pressure escalate. The whispers and cautious glances had transformed into a tense silence, punctuated only by the shuffle of papers and the tapping of pens. They understood now that every action they had taken, or failed to take, was under scrutiny. Marcus's story was no longer personal, it was systemic, a reflection of weaknesses within the department that could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, Marcus began receiving calls from journalists seeking his side of the story. He hesitated at first, unsure how much to share. David advised him to be honest but concise, emphasizing the importance of maintaining composure. Each call was another test of patience and restraint. Marcus realized that public perception could be both a weapon and a shield, amplifying his voice while keeping those responsible accountable. As media attention grew, so did internal investigation efforts. Marcus was asked to provide detailed accounts, to review reports, and to sign statements confirming the inaccuracies in the officers' initial reports. Each form he completed was another step toward justice, yet the process left him emotionally drained. The fear and humiliation of the arrest had not disappeared, they were merely tempered by the knowledge that correction was underway. David, tireless in his efforts, also began strategizing for potential fallout. He anticipated pushback, resistance, and attempts to minimize the officers' mistakes. His experience in politics and law allowed him to navigate the delicate landscape with skill, ensuring that Marcus's case would be treated seriously without unnecessary escalation. He reminded Marcus that patience was crucial, change required persistence and unwavering attention to detail. At the station, the officers involved were becoming increasingly anxious. Meetings with supervisors and internal affairs representatives highlighted the gravity of their errors. Every detail was scrutinized, every report double-checked. They realized that Marcus's release was only the beginning, the department itself was now on trial in the court of public opinion. Their careers, reputations, and credibility were all at stake, and the weight of that realization created tension unlike anything they had experienced before. Marcus, in the midst of this storm, tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. He returned to work, engaged with friends, and tried to reclaim his life, but the emotional toll was undeniable. Every conversation, every glance, every subtle reminder of that night carried the memory of fear and vulnerability. Yet alongside that fear was a growing sense of empowerment. He had endured something few could imagine, and now he had the chance to ensure that such an ordeal could not happen again, not to him, not to anyone. David, observing from afar, orchestrated a coordinated effort to ensure accountability. He arranged for interviews, oversaw the internal review process, and communicated directly with department leadership. His involvement was steady, unwavering, and precise. Marcus could feel the impact even from a distance, the change in tone, the shift in attitude, and the growing acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Each step forward reinforced the lesson that power and responsibility, when used wisely, could alter the course of injustice. As the day drew to a close, Marcus reflected on the events. The fear, the anger, and the humiliation had left their mark, but they had also revealed something deeper. He had learned about resilience, about the importance of family, and about the mechanisms of power that could be wielded to correct mistakes. The night of his arrest had tested him in ways he never imagined, yet it had also strengthened his resolve. Outside, the city lights glimmered in the evening, a silent witness to the drama that had unfolded. Marcus walked slowly, taking in the cool air and the quiet hum of life continuing around him. He understood that while the immediate danger had passed, the broader implications of the night's events would continue to unfold. The officers had been held accountable, but the story was now part of a larger conversation about justice, oversight, and human error. Inside the station, the officers involved met privately with internal affairs representatives. The tension was palpable. They were forced to acknowledge mistakes, to confront procedural failures, and to recognize the power of external influence. Marcus's story had become a catalyst for change, highlighting flaws and demanding corrective action. Every word spoken in those rooms carried weight, and the pressure was immense. By nightfall, Marcus returned home once again, exhausted but resolute. The experience had left him changed, but he felt a newfound clarity. Fear had tested him, injustice had challenged him, and influence had protected him. He realized that life's challenges could be both frightening and revealing, and that survival often depended on a combination of courage, patience, and support from those who could intervene. David, still working late in his office, reviewed reports one last time. The internal review had progressed further than anticipated, the department taking steps to ensure accountability. Marcus's ordeal had become more than a personal story, it had sparked dialogue, reflection, and action. The system, though imperfect, had been reminded of its responsibilities, and David's role in ensuring justice had left an indelible mark on the process. As Marcus lay in bed that night, he thought about the lessons learned. Fear could be overpowering, but resilience could endure. Mistakes could have severe consequences, but advocacy and influence could correct them. And even in the darkest moments, family could provide the strength necessary to navigate uncertainty. The night of terror had passed, but the story of survival, justice, and the fight for accountability would continue to shape his life and the lives of those around him. And while the suspense of the initial arrest had faded, the tension remained in subtle ways: questions about fairness, the impact of public scrutiny, and the lessons learned by those who had caused the ordeal. Marcus understood that the story was not just about him, it was about a system forced to confront its flaws, and the power of one family to ensure that justice was served. The city was buzzing like never before. Marcus Johnson's story had spread across news outlets, social media, and local communities. People were talking, not just about a wrongful arrest, but about accountability, fairness, and the consequences of power misused. Marcus felt both overwhelmed and strangely empowered. He had survived the fear, the handcuffs, and the cold glare of authority, but now he had to navigate a world watching him, judging him, and rallying behind him. David Johnson, sitting in his office surrounded by stacks of reports and messages, felt the tension rising. The media attention was a double-edged sword. It amplified the truth, but it also increased the stakes. Every word spoken in interviews, every news segment, and every social media post had the potential to escalate the situation. He instructed Marcus carefully: answer questions calmly, stick to the facts, and never let anger override composure. The world was watching, and one misstep could shift perception in unexpected ways. Meanwhile, at the police department, the atmosphere had changed completely. Officers who had once been confident and unyielding were now visibly anxious. Meetings with internal affairs and city officials stretched late into the evening, each one scrutinizing every detail of Marcus's arrest. Questions were sharp, the tone tense. The balance of power had shifted decisively, and the department was now reacting under pressure, aware that public opinion and powerful influence demanded accountability. Marcus's phone kept buzzing with messages of support, friends, colleagues, and strangers alike offering encouragement. Each message was a reminder that he was no longer alone, that his story mattered beyond himself. He read the words carefully, letting the encouragement bolster his confidence, even as fatigue weighed heavily on him. Fear from the previous days still lingered, but hope had taken root. He had survived, and now he had a platform to ensure justice extended beyond his own experience. David arranged for formal statements to be released, carefully coordinating with journalists and legal teams. Every sentence was chosen with precision, ensuring that the truth was clear without giving opponents an opportunity to twist the narrative. The public learned about Marcus's ordeal, the wrongful arrest, and the immediate steps taken to correct the injustice. Reactions were swift, messages of outrage, support, and calls for accountability poured in. Marcus realized that his personal nightmare had become a symbol of a larger struggle for fairness and transparency. At the station, the officers involved were struggling under the weight of scrutiny. Every action taken, every word spoken, every report filed was now under examination. They had thought the situation was routine, manageable, but the events had spiraled far beyond their control. The name of David Johnson carried authority that could not be ignored, and the department now faced the challenge of reconciling procedural mistakes with public perception. Tension hung thick in the air, like a storm about to break. Marcus, despite the pressure, tried to reclaim some sense of normalcy. He returned to work and engaged with friends, yet each interaction carried a shadow of the previous night's terror. Every glance, every subtle reminder of authority, stirred memories of fear. Yet alongside those memories was a newfound strength, a belief that surviving injustice and advocating for truth could reshape outcomes, even in a system built on rigid procedures. David continued to monitor events closely. The internal review revealed additional errors, small but significant, that compounded the original mistake. Officers had not followed protocols, overlooked crucial evidence, and acted on assumptions rather than facts. David ensured that these findings were documented and addressed, coordinating with internal affairs to implement corrective measures. His influence was steady, deliberate, and unyielding, a guiding force behind Marcus's emerging vindication. By evening, the media coverage reached a crescendo. Marcus's story was no longer confined to local news. National outlets picked it up, portraying a powerful narrative of injustice confronted by family, persistence, and authority. Social media campaigns amplified the story further, drawing attention from citizens, advocacy groups, and even politicians. Marcus watched in awe as the ripple effect of his experience spread, realizing that his ordeal had sparked a broader conversation about fairness, accountability, and the human impact of systemic mistakes. At the station, the officers involved faced formal interviews and questioning. Each statement, each report, and each explanation was meticulously reviewed. The room was thick with tension. Careers and reputations hung in the balance. Marcus's name carried weight now, a reminder of the influence of truth backed by persistence. The officers' once unshakable confidence had eroded, replaced by a careful, almost fearful attention to every detail. Marcus reflected on the journey he had endured. The fear of arrest, the humiliation of being treated as guilty when innocent, and the uncertainty of his fate had left a deep mark. Yet he also recognized the strength he had gained, resilience born of adversity, the power of family standing unwaveringly behind him, and the ability to confront injustice with calm determination. The experience had changed him, shaping both his perspective and his sense of purpose. David, seeing the final pieces fall into place, prepared to conclude his oversight of the situation. Officers would face consequences where appropriate, procedural reforms would be implemented, and the public would be reassured that justice had been pursued. Yet, he reminded Marcus that vigilance remained important. Mistakes could recur if accountability was not maintained. Marcus absorbed the advice, understanding that the battle for justice extended beyond a single night or a single arrest. As night fell, Marcus sat quietly at home, reflecting on the events. The city outside glimmered with lights, a reminder of life continuing amidst chaos. He thought about the fear he had felt, the uncertainty, and the way the system had initially failed him. But he also thought about the hope, the intervention of family, and the ripple effect of truth when backed by determination and influence. He realized that fear could be confronted, mistakes could be corrected, and justice could prevail when courage and persistence aligned. In the police department, the officers involved were left to confront the consequences of their actions. Meetings, reports, and reviews ensured that accountability was tangible, not abstract. The story of Marcus Johnson had forced the system to reflect, to examine its procedures, and to acknowledge the human cost of errors. The tension that had gripped the department transformed into a cautious awareness, a recognition that authority carried responsibility and that mistakes could no longer be brushed aside. The public response continued to grow, with voices demanding transparency, fairness, and systemic change. Marcus's story had become a catalyst, sparking conversations far beyond his personal experience. It highlighted flaws, demanded accountability, and reminded citizens and officials alike that justice required vigilance. Marcus understood that his ordeal had consequences beyond the immediate, creating awareness and inspiring dialogue that could lead to meaningful reform. By the end of the week, the situation had reached a resolution of sorts. Marcus's record was cleared, officers faced appropriate consequences, and the department implemented procedural changes. The public, informed through careful media coverage, recognized the correction of injustice. Marcus reflected on the journey, from fear to empowerment, from helplessness to advocacy, and from chaos to a semblance of closure. Yet even in resolution, Marcus felt the lingering impact of the experience. The fear, the anxiety, and the humiliation had left marks, subtle but undeniable. But alongside those marks was a newfound strength, a clearer understanding of human resilience, and a profound appreciation for the support of family and the power of advocacy. The story had reached a turning point, but the lessons endured. David, finally allowing himself a moment of relief, looked over the reports one last time. Justice had been served, mistakes had been acknowledged, and Marcus had been vindicated. Yet he knew that vigilance remained crucial. The system was imperfect, human error inevitable, but the intervention, persistence, and authority applied had ensured that at least in this case, fairness prevailed. Marcus lay in bed that night, reflecting on the journey. The fear of the initial arrest, the intervention of his brother, the scrutiny, and the eventual resolution had created a narrative of suspense, courage, and triumph. He understood the fragility of justice, the importance of resilience, and the impact of family standing unwaveringly behind him. The story was not just his own, it was a testament to the power of truth, persistence, and influence when confronted with error. And as the city slept, Marcus felt a cautious peace. The ordeal had tested him, shaped him, and ultimately empowered him. Fear had been confronted, injustice had been challenged, and accountability had been achieved. Yet the lessons would linger, a reminder that courage, vigilance, and family could change even the darkest moments. The days following Marcus Johnson's ordeal passed with a strange mixture of normalcy and lingering tension. The immediate crisis had ended, yet the emotional aftershocks remained. Marcus woke each morning with a cautious awareness, a subtle reminder of the night that had upended his life. The memory of flashing lights, the cold weight of handcuffs, and the uncertainty of his fate haunted him in ways he had never expected. Even as the city moved on, he felt the quiet vigilance of someone who had confronted fear and survived. David Johnson, his brother and unwavering ally, continued to monitor the situation from Washington. He had ensured that internal reviews were completed, officers were held accountable, and procedural reforms were implemented. Yet he knew that influence alone could not erase the emotional toll on Marcus. The intervention had saved him in the moment, but healing required time, reflection, and understanding. David reminded Marcus to focus not just on justice achieved, but on resilience, recovery, and the lessons learned from surviving a system that had faltered. At the police department, the atmosphere had shifted. Officers involved in the wrongful arrest faced consequences, some formal, others informal. There was a cautious awareness among staff, a subtle acknowledgement that mistakes could have profound consequences. Policies were reviewed, procedures tightened, and training adjusted to prevent similar incidents. The department had been forced to confront its shortcomings, and while change would take time, the ripple effect of Marcus's experience was already visible. Marcus, meanwhile, slowly began reclaiming his life. The fear and humiliation of his arrest still lingered, but he found strength in the support of friends, family, and a community that had rallied around him. Every message of encouragement, every conversation about fairness and accountability reinforced the knowledge that his ordeal had meaning beyond himself. He was not just a victim, he was a catalyst for awareness and change. One evening, Marcus walked through the city streets, the cool night air soothing against his skin. He reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from the terror of handcuffs and flashing lights to the cautious freedom he now enjoyed. He thought about the power of family, the importance of advocacy, and the ability of one person's courage to ripple outward, influencing not just outcomes but perceptions, policies, and awareness. Each step he took was a reminder of survival, resilience, and the strength found in confronting fear. David called that evening, his voice steady but warm. "Marcus, you've handled this better than most would. The department is making changes, and the public is aware of the mistakes. But remember, your experience is more than a story, it's a lesson. Use it wisely." Marcus nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. His brother's guidance had been a lifeline, a source of power that had turned a night of terror into a story of survival and change. The media continued to follow the story, though with a shift in focus. Reports highlighted the systemic changes, the accountability measures, and the influence of persistence and truth. Marcus's name became associated not with fear and arrest, but with resilience, advocacy, and justice achieved. Public discussions grew, not just about his personal experience, but about broader issues of fairness, oversight, and the responsibilities of those in power. The story had become larger than himself, a symbol of how courage, family, and vigilance could confront error. Marcus also began receiving messages from people who had faced similar injustices. They shared their own experiences of fear, discrimination, and systemic failure. Each message was a reminder that his ordeal resonated far beyond the confines of a single night. Marcus realized that he could not simply return to life as it had been. His experience had given him a responsibility to lend his voice, to support others, and to advocate for change. The fear he had endured had transformed into purpose. At the police department, the lessons of the night were slowly being absorbed. Policies were updated, officers trained, and procedures scrutinized. The incident had forced reflection, not just on mistakes made, but on the human impact of those mistakes. The officers involved had learned that authority carried responsibility and that even small errors could have far-reaching consequences. The story of Marcus Johnson had left an imprint, a reminder that fairness required vigilance and accountability. In the quiet of his apartment, Marcus thought about the emotional journey he had endured. The fear, the humiliation, and the uncertainty of the arrest had tested him in ways he never imagined. Yet he had emerged stronger, more aware, and more determined. The experience had revealed not only the fragility of justice, but also the power of persistence, the importance of family, and the resilience of the human spirit. Marcus understood that survival was not just about physical freedom, it was about emotional strength, moral courage, and the ability to influence change. David, observing from a distance, felt a quiet satisfaction. Marcus had faced an ordeal that would have broken many, yet he had navigated it with resilience, integrity, and composure. The system had been forced to acknowledge its errors, and corrective actions were underway. Yet David knew that the emotional impact would linger, a reminder that justice is not simply about policy, it is about human lives, experiences, and accountability. As the city slept, Marcus reflected on the night that had started it all, the stop that shouldn't have happened, the fear, the handcuffs, and the uncertainty. It had been a night of terror, yes, but also a night that revealed strength, courage, and the power of family standing firmly by one another. Every memory, though painful, had shaped him into someone stronger, someone more aware, and someone capable of confronting fear with resilience. Over time, Marcus found peace in knowing that his experience had sparked change. The department had implemented reforms, officers were held accountable, and the public had witnessed the correction of a wrong. He also understood the emotional growth he had achieved, the courage to face fear, the wisdom to navigate uncertainty, and the compassion to support others facing injustice. The ordeal had transformed him, leaving an indelible mark of strength, awareness, and resilience. Even as life returned to a sense of normalcy, Marcus remained vigilant. He knew that mistakes could happen again, that systems were imperfect, and that advocacy, courage, and awareness were essential. Yet he also knew that he had faced fear, survived, and emerged stronger. The night of terror had become a story of triumph, resilience, and hope. It had revealed the fragility of systems, the strength of family, and the power of persistence. In the end, Marcus Johnson's journey was a testament to survival, justice, and human resilience. Fear had tested him, injustice had challenged him, and authority had been forced to confront its errors. But through it all, he had found strength, courage, and the knowledge that even the darkest moments could be confronted with integrity, persistence, and family support. The story closed not with finality, but with lessons carried forward, a legacy of resilience, and the enduring power of justice achieved. As Marcus looked out at the city from his apartment window, the lights glimmered like distant stars. He had survived, endured, and grown stronger. The world was vast, complex, and often unfair, but he had learned that fear could be faced, mistakes could be corrected, and resilience could prevail. And in that understanding, he found a quiet, powerful peace, one that would carry him through whatever challenges the future might hold.